energy prices are so much higher. In Italy, the guys I'm working with, they've suffered 10 times, the cost in the last year. They've gone with one dye house has gone from $40,000 a week to $400,000 a week. So once you start to put this process in there and you save an hour, right? Imagine the amount of energy that you're saving, the amount of cost that you're saving there. So, just to quickly answer your question, just on that one metric, you can see there's a huge saving.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the CleanTechies Podcast. This is episode 72 of the show. I'm your host, Silas Maynor, and thank you for joining us on today's episode. Before we get into today's episode details, a quick note from to any founders listening, and then we'll have a bit of a note from our sponsors as well. If you are a founder in the space seeking funding or looking for partnerships, please consider reaching out, as we are also doing our best to introduce founders to capital, to provide introductions wherever we can, and then also want to make introductions to partnership opportunities. There's a lot of people who come on the show who we can oftentimes help find interesting partners in the space to help kind of multiply the work they're doing. And a quick note from our sponsors. Thank you to NextWave Partners for making this show possible. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change yourself, consider reaching out to them at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. And additionally, NextWave has offered to do free consultations with anyone affected by the recent layoffs in tech who are seeking to get into the climate tech space. So again, if you're seeking to get into the climate tech space and you're affected by the recent layoffs, you can consider reaching out to NextWave, and their consultants will gladly do a consultation to help you in your next job search. And then with that, let's get into today's episode details. So today we had the pleasure of speaking with Graham Stewart, the founder of Fiber52. Fiber52 is a sustainable dyeing method to create sustainable cotton. And for those unaware, the textiles industry is very unsustainable, and especially in recent years, the textile industry has become very focused on fast fashion. In its essence, it is very wasteful. So Fiber52 helps solve this through more robust fibers and more recyclable material. In general, just really, really fascinating conversation with Graham. We did talk a little bit about kind of the process of how textiles are traditionally made, how sustainable textiles are made. We talked about the business model, transparency costs across the value chain, and then different challenges that they have, as well as the benefits of sustainable textiles. So very, very holistic episode as usual. And we did speak a tad about fast fashion, and then at the end we wrapped up with a little bit of a kind of a discussion on the old school method of the apprenticeship model for certain types of kind of traditional industries. So it's a very, very interesting episode in general. I certainly learned very, very much from Graham, as this is a topic I've no former expertise in. So really, really great episode. And without any further delay, let's get into our discussion with Graham. All right, welcome to the show, Graham. How are you doing today?
Doing good, Silas, and thanks for inviting me on the pod.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm super excited to have you. We've never had anybody on to discuss this topic in particular, so really excited to discuss this today.
Great.
Why don't we just start with a quick background on yourself and how you got into the space? Really keen. It seems like you have a pretty interesting and pretty long background, so maybe the highlights and the key things that ended up leading you to where you are now.
Yeah, I grew up in a textile town. With textiles surrounding me. I was actually born in a mill, would you believe, so it kind of had to be in my blood. But, where I lived, the biggest dye stuff making company in the world, or factory in the world, was 300 yards from where I lived. Everybody in my street worked in that dye making factory, 6,000 people there. It was a big business then in the UK. And we had three such, large dye making places in the town. And I liked chemistry at school, so I got into becoming a dyer. So, we were the biggest dyers in Europe. We had 12 dye houses. We had weaving mills. We had spinning mills. And, I started there when I was 15 years old, but I did my degree part-time and became what we call a chartered colorist. So my background was fairly heavy on the chemistry side, let's say, and the fiber side of textiles. But yeah, that's pretty much how I got into it, and stuck with it. It's been an unplanned ride, I've got to tell you, which has kind of led me all over the world. But it's certainly been interesting.
Mm-hmm. And could you tell us a little bit about kind of obviously the origin story of how you got into textiles is of course fascinating, but also keen to understand how did you come along to this path of focusing on kind of sustainable materials?
Yeah, good question. I when I came here 9 years ago, I'd spent a lot of time in the States before, but when I came here, I knew that the textile industry had moved. A lot of it, same in England, in Europe, a lot of the textile industry went to other parts of the world. And I came here and started with some partners. I started a sport outdoor brand um, in Montana, but I had to travel to the Carolinas because that's where the bulk of the manufacturing industry was, besides some, out on the West Coast. But there was no supply chain. I actually didn't realize the supply chain I needed had gone. So I had to start from scratch and really work fast and work hard because there was nothing there. If we're going to achieve this brand, I had to move quick and get the fabrics done, to get and forge a supply chain right from the fibers. What happened is I spent a lot of time doing my own dyeing, being a dyer myself. The dye houses kind of let me do what I wanted, providing I paid them enough. And there was a lot of downtime. And one dye house in particular was quite a big one. They said to me, look, we've got all these recipes that have been around for years, 10, 20 years. Do you mind taking a look at them? We don't have a qualified dyer. I looked at them and I was shocked to see that, some of these recipes looked to be like 30, 40 years out of date, but they're still using them. And so the sustainability bit really hit me with the lack of sustainability and having, cotton fabrics in a dye bath for 11 hours, then getting them wrong and having them in for another 3 hours. The fabric was kind of falling apart. So I started testing it and looking at, just how strong it was. It was kind of half the strength of what had gone in there. So I realized there was a lot of damage being done. That was, a kind of eureka moment for me. And I started to work on that to see how I could limit the damage on the fiber, on the fabric, and come out with a more sustainable fabric. And that's how it all began. And of course, if you wish, we can get into, some of the processes that I came up with there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to learn a bit about that. I do want to just hear your comment quick because there's one thing that's kind of striking me right off the bat here is that it seems as though your background and kind of coming through the I don't know if you want to call it hard labor of this kind of growing up in this textile town and learning these things like the hands-on work is kind of what's allowed you to now be an expert in the space. And again, this opportunity to look at these old recipes. So I'm just curious if you have any comments on the current state of the world and how people tend to usually veer away from these types of work. They want to go into tech. They want to do something that's just kind of like brain work only and nothing physical.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I began, this was the tech industry. Uh, Even before I began, the big textile towns in Europe were like Silicon Valley, and of course that changed dramatically. I think the other thing that's changed a lot is education in this area, particularly in textiles, in that there's not that apprentice kind of technical education that existed for me. That was a real platform for me and the other guys who I studied with. That tends not to exist anymore. You've either you've got to go to university, and for instance, there are some fantastic places of education, and I work very closely with NC State University, which is one of the best, if not the best, in the world. Tremendous university, a lot of practical opportunity there in that they have all the machinery, so you can get a good grounding, but it's not everywhere like it used to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is quite fascinating. I think the reason I can relate to this and at least understand the problem is I grew up working for my dad in his cabinetry shop, right? And that's not something you learn overnight, but when you work for him since you're like 10 years old, you start to learn it, and then it expects you to take it over at some point, right? So it's a bit of it's not something you can just go to uni for and then come out knowing exactly how to be a master carpenter, right? So I think it's an interesting kind of dilemma that we face as a society with a lot of these roles. These industries do need people to learn. So I think maybe that's a topic for another podcast. So why don't we get into a little bit? I'm super unfamiliar with how the textile space works generally. So could you walk us through, kind of conventionally speaking, what is the process for making I guess we can stick to, I don't know if there's a difference between the types of fabric, but if you could walk us through the conventional method, and then we can get into what you're doing differently.
Yeah, I mean, you start with the fibers, again, going back, natural fibers were really what everybody had. And then about 60 years ago, that started to change when, man-made fibers, engineered fibers were beginning to be made, like nylon, polyester. And then you had the cellulosic fibers, which were called man-mades. And they started to replace the natural fibers like wool and to some respects, cotton. Moving forward, those fibers go into yarns and then into fabrics and then into apparel. So you've got these stages of process within textiles. I'm sure we're going to talk about Fiber52, which is my process. That's really where there's a lot of pressure these days to change that. We're going from the petro-based fibers back to natural fibers. I can see the move occurring there. It's like an inflection point, and it's right now. And a lot of that's coming with pressure, from investors, from the environmental activists or environmental investors. You can see it happening. I can feel the pressure out there.
Mm-hmm. I know this might be a bit technical, but I am genuinely very curious to understand. When you say it comes from the fibers, what does that actually look like? Could you explain this in like as simple as possible terms for what is the source material? Where do you get this from? What does the process look like to create those? Because I am really curious on how this works.
Yeah, of course, cotton's grown. You see the cotton buds around here in the fields, and they're getting gathered this time of year. That goes through a lot of different processes to get a yarn and to get a fabric. And with synthetic fibers, you've got, a petro base, which then again gets heated up or mixed with another chemical. They get extruded. If that's a process in textiles, extrusion or spun, and they end up going through different processes then to get coloration. And that's where, again, there's a lot of pressure in that coloration space right now. Mm-hmm. And so that's how the fibers become fabrics, and then they're sewn into garments. Yeah. And then, it's up to us to kind of make those supply chains more visible. I think, your questions. Mm.
Yeah, I think it's quite fascinating to understand this, because it sounds as though kind of the traditional method was maybe not necessarily sustainable entirely, but had a lot of sustainable attributes. And then we went to this kind of industrialist era where everything was made from petrochemicals. And now we need to go back in some ways to get rid of this kind of fast fashion stuff. So that is very helpful. So could you talk to us now about the nuances of making this sustainable, aside from kind of going with an organic fiber? What are the other processes here that really make this fabric actually sustainable?
Yeah, good question, Silas. I think that, you mentioned organic, for instance. There's been a lot of scandal around the organic thing over the past year or two, in that those supply chains weren't as clear as everybody thought they were. And, the governing bodies had problems. That doesn't affect me too much right now. What I'm doing is replacing really the heavy chemicals that have been used in processing by using bioproducts. And so what I looked at is there are these long processes where they're using very heavy chemicals. Can I get rid of those chemicals? Can I replace them with natural products? That's taken me about 2.5 years. And now we've got to a point where we're commercial. But what I've done is I've started to process cotton in a way that is much, much more sustainable. And we've actually done, we employed a PhD to do a life cycle analysis on Fiber52, just to see what the difference is between the traditional processing, which is the majority of what happens these days, versus Fiber52. And, there's some big outcomes there in the carbon dioxide, the water reduction, the heat reduction, the power reduction, that's a big deal.
Mm-hmm. So largely speaking, aside from the materials themselves and sourcing more responsible materials, there's a lot of focus on essentially making the entire process a lot more efficient. And then I assume at some point shifting over to ensuring that the power used in this is renewable power, correct? To make it truly sustainable.
Correct. I mean, this natural process is much faster. It's catalyzed. And that's how I can use low temperatures and less time. And slowly but very surely, the word's getting out. I kind of focused on getting this process out within the US, but we're already in Asia. We're already doing a big project in Italy with some very famous brands, which we've got, fantastic results this week. And the brands are looking and saying, yeah, this is different. Hey, this is, way more sustainable than what we've had. And we'd like to be part of it, which is happening. That's the here and now. That's today for me.
Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of curious. I don't know if this is necessarily your role within the company, but I am curious to understand a little bit about the business model, right? A lot of people talk about how Tesla started out with a more expensive car in order to break into the market. Is that the case now as you're refining the process, that you start out with the more kind of high-end fabrics and kind of go into those markets, and then at some point with the efficiencies increasing, you'll be able to kind of go to a market that's competitive with other, I guess, industrial versions of textiles?
Not really. What happened is I started out with processors in the mass market. I went to some big guys, and of course, the first question is, wait a minute, how much does this cost? And the answer to that isn't totally simple, because you might look at the products that are being used and you might cost them out. They're actually not that much different. You might find the natural products are a little bit more expensive, but once you then take into consideration your energy savings, which is one big deal these days, right? Energy prices are so much higher. In Italy, the guys I'm working with, they've suffered 10 times, the cost in the last year. They've gone with one dye house has gone from $40,000 a week to $400,000 a week. So once you start to put this process in there and you save an hour, right? Imagine the amount of energy that you're saving, the amount of cost that you're saving there. So, just to quickly answer your question, just on that one metric, you can see there's a huge saving, and we're working on costing that with the partners that we've got right now. The same is with water. The water's becoming more expensive. And, this industry is famously wasteful with water. And this process, this process saves water, is very efficient in using water in the machinery that's around the world. I'm not talking about using new machines that are going to cost you millions of dollars. This process can be put in straight into the machines that have been around for 20, 30 years. So again, you've got to cost that against what you're doing right now. And then that's really what's happening real time. That's where we're getting noticed.
Mm-hmm. That is quite fascinating that you're able to go straight to the mass market. I would have not assumed that. I really appreciate you sharing that. You mentioned, I want to go, I kind of skipped over this. I wanted to go back onto it, which is, you talked about the carbon footprint of we'll just call them industrial textiles for now, or kind of conventional textiles. What do you have any data on how much impact this has on the kind of carbon emissions globally on a yearly basis? Are there estimates around this, and how much can be mitigated if we really kind of shift to this kind of as a whole?
Yeah, I think on the big picture, there are only estimates. That's why we wanted to do our own life cycle analysis. My colleague who joined us is from Bangladesh. He managed to get us a lot of information out of that area, for instance. as to what's going on there, how much energy they're using, what that energy costs, what the water costs. So we could be quite specific about it. And we went, I used the information that I've got from the US with some big guys here and some in Europe. And we put all that together. And, we're saying we can save up to, and this is also advisors, because we can't say it's going to be 50% saving every time, because the machinery is different. If you use a 30-year-old machine, you've got a bit of a difference to a brand new 2-year-old machine that's brand new in textiles, put it that way. And so, we managed to find that we were between, and I haven't got the figures in front of me, but we were between 20 and 50% better than what's happening right now. That's in the carbon, that's in CO2. In water was around the same, around 50%. And in energy, I think it was a little bit less, about 40%. But, those numbers are big numbers, but it's up to, it can be, 20, 40.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really fascinating that you've made a way for this to work without changing the machinery, because that's usually in any type of manufacturing. Usually the biggest concern is like, we can't just buy new machines. We've bought these, on a 30-year amortization or whatever it is. And you can't exactly just go and replace these things, right? So that's it. That is fascinating. One thing I did want to also touch on, I don't know if you mentioned this already, I might have missed this. How did you ultimately come across and develop this sustainable process? Because it sounds like it's largely in the process. Is this something that you've known a long time and you just really started to implement it? Or did you have to test this a lot? Kind of where did the technology come from?
It was very incremental, I've got to tell you, back to the recipes that I saw. I started to look at a better way to do things. And I kept making gains. And this is over a long period of time. My first year, I didn't make too many gains. But then, I had a kind of eureka moment when I got the process down to a time that I really wanted it to be within, really to save a lot of time as to what's going on now. But the big point there was, can I repeat it? It's okay doing it once, but you got to do it time after time after time. And that's when I was lucky to meet, people who were like-minded, and we were able to start and finance this whole thing and move it forward.
Yeah, interesting. I always find it fascinating how people come across these things, and especially for people coming in from industries where it is a hands-on experience that you grew up with, and that's kind of what you did. Usually those people who are working in the conventional spaces know what's going wrong, right? They know how things work, so they are able to solve these problems, not just some PhD going and say, hey, I'm here to save the day. Let me figure this out. Somebody who's been in the space and understands how it works.
It's important. And textiles is like that. In many textile areas, there's not so much even written about it. You go and find a book on spinning in a certain way, or making a fabric in a certain way, and processing it and dyeing it in a certain way. Often there's just not that much information around, but it's also, as you say, the practicalities of, I've even though I've had executive roles, somehow I've managed to find myself back in a dye house, or it just doesn't happen that you get away from that. And, I've got to say thank you, because I enjoy it. I really enjoy it. It's great to, you feel a sense of achievement when you've had your hands on the machines and something works,
Yeah, it sounds similar to the saying, once a farmer, always a farmer, which is said a lot in my family. So I can understand and relate in some ways. One thing I want to talk about was a little bit about the business model. So are you willing to speak about what model you're pursuing? Is this going to be, you're going to license the technology out? You're going to try to do your own projects? Could you kind of talk about this for people who are curious?
Yeah, I mean, there were so many ways we could do this, right? We could invest in, for instance, buy a dye house, buy a weaving company, buy a knitting company, and make it all ourselves, and then sell that to the brands or whatever. We decided we would. It is a process, by the way. So Fiber52 is a process, and so the licensing model works really well in that we can license this process right around the world, in existing, as we said, in existing machinery. And we've spent a lot of our investment has been with lawyers, because it's very Very easy to transfer this process anywhere in the world. You might say that's an advantage. It's also a disadvantage that it's so easy to do. And so in working with partners around the world, we do NDAs, but we've got a very, very clear licensing agreement as to how that works and as to how we can monitor it. You know, it's okay having a licensing agreement, but if you don't have good partners who will allow you to monitor it, it's not worth a lot. So the people we're working with, they're being very transparent and allowing us to, you know, work with them, see how much production they've done in a week or a month, and then charge them a very small fair fee on that. And that's how we get our revenue.
That's actually quite fascinating. Could you talk more about this process of tracking and following the process? You mentioned earlier the need for transparency in the space. I'm curious if you want to talk a little bit about that and how you may be working together with some of the kind of ESG and sustainability reporting agencies and things of that nature. I'm just really curious to understand that process and where the big room for improvement is.
You know, well, initially, what I wanted to do is I knew of a company, a software company that came out of the textile business. The guys who found, or the gentleman that founded this software company, came from a very famous textile brand, and he's developed software over the last 20 years that works with the brands, the manufacturers. So it gives you visibility absolutely all the way through the chain. And there are all the doors and so on that can be opened from each way that actually track what's going on, like real time, all the way through the supply chain and back again. So that gives us full visibility. And it's not just guys like me. The people I work with are in Houston, I'm in Charleston, South Carolina, but they can use this software and monitor what's going on day to day. The other thing that I have done though is, you know, I've gone to partners and said, look, can we look at your production 6 months back? There's some have said no, and that's made it difficult. Others have said, sure, you know, our books are open. The reason I do that is I want to see that going 6 months forward, if it's kind of half the production, I may ask some questions. You know, it might be seasonality, it might be that the economy is downturning, but it may be that, you know, we're not just getting the reporting that we should be. So that's in a nutshell how we monitor the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. That is interesting. I think it's really fascinating to me how these challenges are being tackled in the entire kind of industrial manufacturing of any sort, manufacturing anything, right? Tracking this information is super important, I think, to investors right now. A lot of them are asking, hey, we need to understand the kind of the ESG metrics of what you're doing, but also what your suppliers are doing, right? So maybe could you speak to that a little bit about the suppliers that you're working with? You oftentimes struggle to try to find ways to help them get more sustainable to make the entire process kind of more environmentally friendly.
Yeah, I mean, look, you're absolutely right, Silas. The ESG pressure is there, right? No question. But I've been fortunate with some of the bigger guys here in the US. They've allowed me into their mills, and we've actually graphed the whole process. You know, so they've let me graph their process going to a particular user, you know, a fabric that's been processed, and then my process or our process versus that process, and graphed it out so it's crystal clear what's going on. They can see, you know, where their changes should be. Now, that said, it's okay identifying where change can happen and identifying where you can help the environment. Actually doing it's a different thing. So if you're a manufacturer, you've just had a pandemic, sometimes the last thing you want to do is to have a new process. You want to be getting back to normal, making as much as you possibly can, and, you know, making up for lost time over the last 2 or 3 years. I'm arguing that this is the time to do it. You know, make your break now, get these processes in place, and you're going to save money, but you're going to have better outcomes. The environment's going to be better. You're going to be better, and let's face it, your investors are going to be happier. And that's working. There's no doubt that's working.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's obviously it may not be perhaps seen right away, but or maybe some companies aren't even taking advantage of it. But there's most certainly got to be an advantage, kind of the green advantage, which we're seeing in a lot of the industries where companies are being sustainable. They're marketing it and they're proving it that through the transparency, and as a result, customers are happier, right? Because there is a customer demand to have sustainable products. I know that I tend to look for sustainable products whenever I'm buying stuff, and I know a lot of people who do the same. One thing you did mention earlier, which I wanted to come back to because I think it's important to mention this if it's correct, if I got this correct, which was if the overall process of doing this dyeing process takes less time, would that mean that typically a manufacturing plant can actually produce more in the same amount of time
Yeah,
in addition to the
absolutely. I mean, one owner came to me, and he'd been quite resistant. And what we've had to do is we've said, look, guys, we'll buy our own fabric and process it. So we'll pay you to allow us to process the fabric in your plant so you can see what's going on. And one guy, he realized he would save 1,200 hours per month if he used our process, the Fiber52 process versus the traditional process he's using now. So that's the kind of thing we're seeing. And that's a big deal, for the guys who then go, oh boy, I can save all those hours. That's a lot of money. That really does kind of hit them between the eyes. And then, we can look at sustainability as well, but that's sustainability. It's helping them save power. It's helping the environment, but it's also making them sustainably more profitable.
Mm-hmm. One thing I want to talk about as well is with maybe the journey in general, or maybe perhaps some of the particular challenges you do face on a daily basis with the sales process. What are or have been the big challenges that you've faced, and how did you overcome those? Are there, maybe items you might mention for other people in the space, or, ways that other companies that you had to interact with need to improve in order to help this whole climate tech ecosystem function better and innovate sooner?
Yeah, again, it's down to practices, training practices, and also, I mean, the big obstacle for me, if there is one, has been the fact that these are new natural products. They're not already in the processing plant. Once you get them in there, it's okay, it's fine, because the guys or the girls who are on the shop floor are just doing the same things. It's just a different product. It's removing a chemical, but you've got another product there, which is in the same size drum, the same amount of liquid. You just pour it in the same area and away you go. Getting around that, though, is tough, because that means, you've got to get through a barrier as to, well, we've really got to want to do this. And there are so many pressures that will happen. And in many cases, it will happen slowly, but in other cases, I think it will happen rather quickly. So,
yes. So just to clarify that, you're saying that generally speaking, the process for the people in the plants is the same process, perhaps minus one thing, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. They don't have to change much.
Yeah, I think that's something I've noticed in the space that seems really fascinating. Is people tend to get into the weeds of this and understand what are we going to do to avoid people having to have behavior change, right? Because in a manufacturing setting, that's not easy to achieve, right, on a scale. Absolutely. So I guess one thing I did just kind of start closing things down here. I want to hear if you feel like commenting on it. Your thoughts, generally speaking, on fast fashion. I know this has been a topic, especially with kind of consumerism and things of that nature. If you want to just comment about it and how negatively impactful it is to the world for people who are unaware.
Yeah, I think fast fashion obviously has come on very, very quickly, and I think the issue there is that's put a lot of pressure on manufacturers, right, to get down to the last cent. Because fast fashion in most cases is selling very, very cheaply, and that's their reason to be there, is that they'll get a product to a consumer at a much cheaper price. But also it's the value that is important, in that how do we educate somebody to buy a product that's more sustainable, more valuable, but less, not to buy it so often, and really walk the talk. And, what I would say to any consumer is it's becoming easier to look at the supply chains for fast fashion. I think the problem has been that as a consumer, you pick up a garment, but there's no history to it. There's a price tag, but there's not the history there. That's changing. And that's where ESG is coming in as well. Those changes are coming quite quickly. And companies, I mean, big fashion companies are being asked about their practices. They're being asked about the supply chains, and they're being asked not to greenwash. They're being asked to give far more information. And there's so much pressure day by day. You see, I mean, I saw one today, big articles every day in the newspapers and on TV about pressure coming on to fast fashion companies and brands to be more visible in the supply chains and how they do things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate.
Sorry, and of course I should say, and it's also, you know, consumers should try to strive and see what's on their apparel. Should ask the question, what's on this, you know, and it's a pretty good question. And if you're doubtful, I wouldn't buy it. You know, if you're really doubtful, don't buy it, and that will put pressure on, you know, on the sustainability practices of those selling fast fashion.
Mm-hmm. There's two things, I guess. First, I have a comment is I think it is important for consumers to realize that there is not this need to constantly have new things. I think that's a tough one, right? That's a behavioral change that we're asking a lot of people to do. But if you can kind of develop a mentality of frugality, if you will, around, hey, I can buy something that's kind of timeless and will last a lot longer, right? And that's usually how I shop personally. But obviously, not everybody, not everybody is okay with the same things over and over again. But I think that's just a comment I had. And then the other thing I wanted to ask is, are there any, you know, you talk about the lack of transparency in supply chain, and there's been other industries that have had this issue and that have addressed this. Are there certain designations or kind of stamps of approval that are reliable that people can look for to say, hey, I know that this is accurate because this is a super rigorous program, and we know that this is sustainably sourced. You know, it's not not made with child labor or things of that nature.
Yeah, there are some very good certifying bodies around that do a great job in this space. You know, so generally, if you've got a certification, for instance, GOTS with the organic, you know, the organic sustainability certification mark there. If you've got something like that, and there are many of them, it's well worth just checking that they are on the garment, you know, or if there's a couple of them on the garment, what do they actually mean? Mm-hmm. So yeah, you can check, and that becomes easier more and more as those certification bodies gain more strength.
Well, which are the ones that you're familiar with that you recommend people keep an eye out for specifically?
Well, GOTS I've just mentioned. I mean, in the processing side of things, there's an organization, I should say, called Blue Sign. You may have seen them. And again, they very carefully monitor what's going on. There's the Better Cotton Initiative, BCI. I don't know whether you've seen that one. And then, you know, aside from those, there are other initiatives which, you know, quite interest me and with what I'm doing. In that, I think you mentioned recycling. You know, I'm looking at polyesters, for instance, right now that don't need to be recycled. They're compostable, or when they can't be recycled, for instance. Mm-hmm. You know, recycling polyester, you're still going to have this fiber damage in the water. It's going to be there for 1,000 years. If you've got a compostable product, which could be a nylon or a polyester, those products will disappear. They'll compost like a natural fiber. So again, look out for those signs too. Look out for that certification, because I think that's quite important in textiles and fast fashion.
Mm-hmm. I would assume, maybe you can just confirm this, and maybe not a long-winded answer here, but with your process, and especially the kind of the rigorous tracking of the entire kind of manufacturing process, does it make it for your partners a lot easier for them to get these certifications because they have this data that they can share with the reporting agencies?
Absolutely, because we work with those certification agencies. We're working with them now, and we are getting certification ourselves. When we pass that process on, bang, you've got that certification. It's there for you, right? And so it makes it a lot easier for the people who are, you know, utilizing or paying a license for Fiber52, because the certification is much easier.
Interesting. That's really helpful for people to understand. I think if anybody's listening, definitely take note of that. I think this is, oh, sorry, there's one last main thing I do want to ask, which is, we talked about it earlier, which is kind of, there's not necessarily an apprenticeship model anymore. It's really big focus on university, et cetera. For people who want to get into this space, maybe that is, I know there's probably a lot of people who want to design fashion brands, but perhaps people who also want to get into making textiles more sustainable. What are your recommendations for people in terms of what they should do, especially maybe somebody coming out of primary school, going into uni, what they should be looking at, people they should talk to, et cetera? Like, what are your recommendations?
Well, just to start with the basics, there's so much online that you can take interest in. Let's face it. And then, if you go into a university, as I mentioned, NC State, that's fabulous because you're going to be able to use their machinery. You're going to be able to understand processes, the supply lines, how things come together. That's also great. But I think, Silas, what you're saying is, yes, there is a gap there between leaving school and university, whereas before there were all these technical courses that you could do in between and work 4.5 days a week where you get your hands wet. You're turning the dials and this, that, and the other, you're handling the product, whatever it may be. To get to that these days, yes, it's a bit harder, but start somewhere. I know a lot of people that have said, okay, I'm out of school, what do I do? Maybe I don't want to go to university. Maybe I'll find a company and I'll apply and I'll get my hands dirty and do my best. And there's nothing better than working your way up the ladder.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, and be prepared to move.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the other thing.
Do you see a comeback happening by chance, for these types of industries that really were traditionally kind of apprenticeship models and learning through years of experience? Do you see that coming back at all?
Yeah, I do. I can see that there's pressure on the companies. I mean, the American textile industry I think is growing. It's getting better, and I see it out there daily. But I think there are changes there. That the onshoring thing's not happening in a big way, right? Or the reshoring thing is not happening in a big way. But there are things that are happening out there that are good. If that's your question, I'm not quite sure.
No, it is. I think I'm just very curious because I didn't go to university either, and I kind of worked my way into learning sales and things of that nature. So I think I'm just always curious to see if there's a kind of change back as university costs continue to get really, really expensive, and a lot of people tend to doubt whether or not it's worth going into, or the people who've gone through it doubt whether or not it was worth it, right?
Yeah, and I think that the point I should have made is that companies are willing to invest in that more and more. They see the gap, they feel the gap, right? They feel the gap. We want younger guys. I had this conversation with a really big manufacturer here. He said, all my people are old. Where can I find the young guys? It's just not so easy. And I'd said to him, this was over a year ago. I think it's up to you. You've got to invest. You got to get some young people on board. You've got to train them, and they're doing that. They're actually doing it. So that's what I'm saying. I'm seeing it happening. It may not be that the onshoring or the reshoring things happening, but certainly getting young people, even before university education, into working in these environments in industry is definitely happening.
Yeah, I think it's something that, from my personal experience, you just don't know these things, right? You need to have the exposure to it and see what it's like, because I know so many of my peers who have gone to university, gone into something that they thought they would like, and then it turns out they hate it, right? I had a similar experience, but it wasn't from university. I was like, oh, I'm going to love this thing. Turns out I needed something else, right? And then I was able to adjust that quickly. So I do hope that this comes back where people can at least try these things out maybe earlier on and get a feel for the direction they want to head. I think this is a good place to end it. Want to maybe hear just final thoughts from your side on where you see the space going, things you're excited for about the future, perhaps, the next challenges that you see coming down the pipeline. Just kind of closing thoughts from yourself.
I mean, I'm excited to see environmental change, that's for sure, going in the right direction. as we've discussed, saving water, saving energy. It's so imperative right now to see the cleaner practices happening, to see less heavy chemicals being used. But also a big deal for me is the supply chains being more visible, and the industry really looking at. I think something you mentioned there is, well, maybe don't buy as much, but buy good. Buy something that's going to be timeless. It's going to wear 10 years instead of 5 months or something. And a less disposable industry. And I think that even fast fashion has to look at what's going on there, because we're all trying to do our bit and make sure that we buy value rather than we buy something that's just more disposable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's really, really helpful to hear your thoughts on that. And I am excited, and I do have a lot of optimism. I tend to be a pretty optimistic person, but I have a lot of optimism for people realizing these things, especially as climate change begins to affect more and more people, and we really see the effects of it. I think people will have more constant reminders, because it's not just some far distant land that's getting the effects. It's people in the Western world, right, are starting to see it. So I think I do have hope that people will change, but I think this has been a really great episode. I really appreciate you coming on, and I look forward to seeing what you guys continue to do.
Thanks, Silas. It's been a real pleasure, and thanks for all the questions.
Absolutely, 100%. Thanks so much for tuning into today's episode. Please let us know what you thought of the show. You can reach us over our Slack channel. You can comment on LinkedIn, reach me on Twitter, whatever you like. Generally pretty available to be reached everywhere. And we also ask that you please do share this with somebody who might find it interesting. There's a lot of people out there who are unfamiliar with the technologies in this space, so please consider sharing with one or two people. It really helps to gain more awareness of the space, and it's very much in line with why we started this entire thing in the first place. We also encourage you to reach out to Graham on LinkedIn to kind of follow what they're doing, perhaps connect with him if you're interested in collaborating in the space, and then check out their website for more details. And if you are joining us for the first time, we do ask that you please subscribe and turn on notifications so you can be able to follow along the show. We really do appreciate this. And if you enjoyed the show, we'd always definitely appreciate a rating, especially on Apple Podcasts, as it helps us to get greater distribution. And then a quick note, our next episode is going to be a conversation with founder, author, and professor at Columbia, Bruce Usher. This discussion was a broader discussion around the various climate solutions out there, how the finance industry's outlook has shifted over the past 20 or so years, and his thoughts and feedback on COP27, which he had the pleasure to attend recently. So if you're interested in hearing how COP27 went from somebody who attended, stay tuned for this episode with Bruce coming soon. And again, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of CleanTechies the Podcast, and we will see you next time.